Now going to start the second session, and the second session is on animal welfare. It's a similar but shorter format to the first session. We have 2 speakers and 1 facilitator, and each of the sessions will be 15 minutes long. So we might just about catch up. I think it was a big mistake to have the veal ready at coffee time, but anyway, we'll get there. So our first speaker in the second session is Professor Francoise Wemelsfelder, and I never quite managed to pronounce that correctly. And a bit like Christine Watson in the first session, she's been talking about animal welfare and animals and sentient beings for 20 years at least. And again, it's beginning to become sexy. So over to you, Francoise.
Thank you very much, Wilma, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to contribute, because I've spent many happy hours here roaming the farm, filming happy animals, so it's wonderful to contribute. And as Wilma said, the title she gave me was Animals as Sentient Beings. And the concept of animal sentience is becoming increasingly important in the law, in our science, talking about what is animal welfare and how can we apply it. So what I'll do is I'll start with a brief discussion of what actually do we mean by animal sentience. Is it something quite philosophical and theoretical, or is it something we can actually see? And what are the implications for ethical farming, and some brief conclusions. So many people associate the question about sentience with intelligence, with the question, are animals smart? And there's no doubt that they are. There is abundant evidence that animals indeed are very smart right across the species spectrum. Fascinating books have recently come out on the genius of birds, what fish knows, work that shows that fish can play basketball, that animals can recognize themselves in mirrors, they can create tools, and that chickens are so intelligent they get mistaken for monkeys. However, it is also recently becoming more evident that the way we approach this can be very human-centered. We're asking perhaps too much to which extent animals are like us. And so now books are asking questions like here, Frans de Waal, are we smart enough to know how smart animals are? And in this recent book here, what would animals say if we asked them the right question? So sentience is really not so much about to which extent are animals like us. It is about animals having their own perspective, and us asking, what is life like for them? And the question is, can we understand what is it like to be a chicken or a pig or a cow? And the assumption is often made, the classic position you could say, is that no, actually we can't know that, because what animals experience, or anyone, is private. However, I'd like to go back here to the work of one of the world's leading authorities in this area of thought, the philosopher Thomas Nagel, who wrote a world-famous paper that many animal welfare scientists quote, "What is it like to be a bat?" And it's worth looking at what he actually says. Is this working, the microphone, yeah? Can you hear me? Okay, good. He says, the point of view in question, that is, what is it like to be a cow, is not one accessible only to a single individual. One person can say of another sentient being, what the quality of the other's experience is. So, indeed, we may not be able to know what it is like to be a cow because we aren't cows and we aren't bats. But that doesn't mean that we can't meet them as other sentient beings for whom the world has meaning. And we can make an effort to learn more about the quality, what that meaning is, and the quality of their experience. And I suggest to you that when we do that, we actually enter a moral landscape. That when we look at animals as sentient beings, animals no longer are systems to manage, not even good welfare systems. They become fellow beings that we work with and care for. And so that is not primarily about smartness or brain complexity or functional biology, as important as these clearly all are. Because if you think about our duty to care for humans, for children or the elderly, we do not make that care primarily dependent on smartness or functional biology. That is really morally very unacceptable. So, regarding animals as sentient beings, or humans and animals as sentient beings, is primarily about communication, about finding out what life is like and can be like for them, and to act from there and enable these beings to create such lives. And you may think perhaps, well, that's all very philosophical, that sounds very theoretical, but I found this lovely quote from a dairy farmer in a very recent paper by one of my colleagues at SRUC, Belinda Vigas. She wrote a paper about views by citizens and farmers towards animal welfare. And I think this quote really reflects what I'm trying to say here. He says, the way I see it, you would look at the cow's perspective on life rather than yours. What would the cow want out of life rather than what you want the cow to have? What does the cow want to do? I feel, he says, we underestimate that. We think we know, and we think we can because it's an animal, we heard it, we tell it what to do, and all the rest of it. And then he goes on to describe all the wonderful, beautiful resources that he gives his animals. But he says, even with all those resources, they are still dead keen to go out of the house. So you've got to let the cow go out. You've got to let it go out. Because that cow will reward you for giving it its choice. So I think that's a lovely description about the mutual relationship between sentient beings that life on farm can potentially be like. And so if we ask ourselves, how can we know what animals feel, what their perspective is? Clearly that is a key question in animal welfare science. And there has been an explosion here as well of very interesting research at SRUC and worldwide about what animals choose, about body signals that reflect what animals feel, such as ear position or facial expressions or underlying neural mechanisms. And that is very important research, and it's important to give it a scientific foundation to the idea of sentience. But it seemed to me also that if we are to think about sentience and the animal's perspective, in addition to looking at the animal's physical body, we must also look at it and study it as a whole sentient animal, who, after all, is doing the feeling. And so there are many ways of doing that, but my particular journey has been to, together with many colleagues at SRUC and again in the UK and across the world, to develop a methodology called qualitative behavior assessment. And this method focuses on how animals emotionally and dynamically express themselves while they are moving. Their whole, you could say, their whole body, a body language that expresses the quality of how they are moving and engaging with the environment. So you could say that reflects the quality of their experience. Very common sense questions. Is the way in which the animal is behaving relaxed or curious, uncomfortable or distressed? And these are very qualitative type of assessments, but we have found ways to also quantify this scientifically and be able to analyze it scientifically and produce scientific evidence using this method so that it could have scientific credibility. And we have found that even though scientists had at the start get a bit used to these unusually qualitative types of assessments, our research has shown that it can be scientifically robust if done well. And we're very happy that in recent years there has been increasing interest from the farming industry and other stakeholders in putting this approach to practical use as well. And what I'm hoping that one of the contributions that QBA can make is that actually, quite simply, it can alert us to the fact that we can maybe see more than we think when we look at animals, that we can see sentience at work. It's not just something that goes on in the animal's head. And I know we have very limited time, but I would really like to show you two very brief video fragments. And these are, oh, can we just, well, I'll just go back and then start it again. So these are two brief video clips of small groups of cows. They are not representative, they're too short, they are not really measuring welfare directly. They're both good welfare farms. I would just like to ask you just for yourself to look at these. I'll play them, the two clips, one after the other, and ask yourself, what can I see? Are there differences in how these cows are engaging and expressing themselves? Differences in their body language, or words that come to your mind about what you think they may be feeling, just as an exercise. So just if you think to yourself, what is the expressivity of these animals? Are there any differences? Anybody, 2 seconds, any words that come to your mind?
Second batch of bored. Yeah, the first cow seemed very alert and curious.
Thank you, yes. Well, I hope you'll chat amongst yourself later. I can't really say. So animated, that's the first clip. That's interesting, and more passive here. So it is a pity we have clearly so little time, but the way I would, in this context, summarize perhaps that difference, I think the terms you gave were very appropriate, is that in that first clip, which was shot here on this farm, the animals have so much more choice and time, what they're doing, where they're doing it, how long for, with whom. They are truly engaged in managing their own life, whereas the second cow and the second clip can have very good health and welfare, but is much more, in these clips anyway, more passive, more managed rather than self-managing. And so that matters to animals. Animals want to engage, choose, make decisions, become competent at creating their own life rather than just passively consume resources. And there is very good scientific evidence that supports this. Animals build nests even if you give them a ready-made nest. They will search and work for food in the presence of ready-made food. And they will go looking for new things to explore. They just like to encounter new things, and they value play and social interaction in their own right. So animals do want to create their own life. And so finally, how does that affect the way we can farm with animals? And I thought to myself, well, why look for examples somewhere else when further ahead, when in fact we are here together on a farm that has created a fantastic example of working with these principles. As I'm sure I don't need to tell you, everybody knows, David and Wilma Finley on the ethical dairy have worked for years to create a system where cows and calves can live together rather than the calves being taken away soon after birth. And they have performed pioneering work in making this possible, and I think it's an excellent example of investing huge moral effort into enabling animals to create a life that matters to them from their point of view. So in the first 8 weeks, the cow and the calves are not separated at all. And then from 8 weeks onwards, they are separated overnight, so the cow can be milked in the morning, but then they're back together for the rest of the day. And I think that's a huge difference from the conventional system. And it's not been easy for the Finleys, if you read David's website, it's clear, and as you've both mentioned, it's taken years to even approach a commercially viable way of doing this. And so I think this is a fantastic example, very impressive, and I'd like to congratulate you. I think it's only right that we do that today. But it's not only about cows and calves living together. There is extensive summer grazing on a farm like this, where animals truly have the space to create preferred patterns of behavior, such as here you can see synchronous grazing, or running and playing together, or going and resting somewhere in a place that you like in a social configuration that you prefer. And the same is true, I'd just like to briefly, the other farm where I spent quite considerable time filming was Whitmuir Farm, also an organizer of this conference. And the other two farms, I just simply haven't visited them, so I'm sure it's the same. These are all stills from my own videos, except, of course, that one. But at Whitmuir Farm, animals can roam freely. There are no boundaries. And especially also there are woods, which is quite important given that pigs and chickens are forest animals. And so here I am standing on top of the hill, and this sow comes out of the woods, just doing its own things, and then goes back into the woods. And they can sleep together on top of the hill in the place they like. It was truly, for me, it was almost like I was on safari, seeing elephants coming out, except now they were pigs coming out of the woods. But my favorite example probably is that chicken there. Sorry. There I was with my tripod and camera in the woods, and this chicken appears all on its own, miles away from its mate in the field. And it was just busy grazing and pecking and scratching. And I thought, this chicken is on an expedition. And the most striking thing was that it had no interest in me at all. This is not zoomed in. I'm standing right next to it, and it's paying me zero attention. It's not even looking at me once. It has absolutely no fear. So I stood and I thought, wow, this animal really has a life. So finally then, I'm hoping in this whirlwind journey discussion that I have clarified a bit that I think the notion of animal sentience is absolutely one that can support the integrated nature of farming ethically. But not just by putting the separate bits of the puzzle together, but actually by realizing that animals as sentient beings are our fellow beings who can co-create the farming environment with us, as very much is the case on many of the farms, and I'm sure many of your farms who are here. And it is, as in fact the minister said this morning, I love the phrase she used, it's about working with animals and with nature as a whole. And that will be good for us, clearly, as all the talks this morning illustrated, because we create a shared, interdependent, high-quality life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francoise. And our next speaker is Dr. Angela Wright, who works in policy for both Compassionate World Farming and Pasture for Life. And she herself has been a smallholder, so she's not just an academic.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And just to prove that I did used to have sheep, I have a little video of my sheep whilst I'm doing the introduction. So a little bit about me. I taught vets animal welfare science at the Royal Veterinary College, University of London, before deciding I wanted to do something even more proactive to make a difference to the life of animals. So I was lucky enough to go to Compassion in Wild Farming, who are, global leaders in farm animal welfare. And we take a very pragmatic approach to welfare. We work directly with farmers and food producers and corporates to make sure that animals that are in existing systems have a better quality of welfare as time goes forward. But we also work in the sort of the bigger picture level where we're trying to change policy at local, European, although that's a dirty word at the moment, and international, sort of global level. So what I do, a lot these days is flit around the world. Here I was in Nairobi at the UN Environment Agency. What Compassion in Wild Farming wants to achieve is a global shift to extensive, sustainable, ethical farming, which is a system that we don't have generally, although obviously it's wonderful to come and talk to an audience like you because you guys are there and you're on that page already. So yeah, it's an absolute treat. So Francoise went first because she's done an absolutely fabulous overview of why animals matter and why we need to care about their welfare. But if you ask different people what they mean by welfare, you get so many different answers. And I particularly find that the more global we get and the different groups that we have in the room, people adapt what they think welfare is so that it suits their organisation's position. So one of the things that I spent some time doing when I was at the Royal Vet College was trying to find a way to explain to lay people, not just welfare scientists, what welfare is and how you can sort of frame it conceptually, bearing in mind that animals are sentient beings and they have lives that matter to them, as we've been shown so well. So I worked with Professor Christopher Wathis, who was then chair of the UK Farm Animal Welfare Council or Committee, or whichever one it is now. And they were very keen on quality of life and ensuring animals had a good life, or at least a life worth living. And quality of life, it's been borrowed from human assessment of quality of life, but it has three components. We talk about the mental well-being of animals. Well, Francoise has described that so beautifully. Everything, the three components for me come back to mental well-being, and I'll unpack that a little bit more as we go through. So there's physical well-being. Now, particularly when you hear policymakers talking, they talk about animal health and welfare. And welfare is the add-on, and health is the thing that seems to get the most interest. However, health is really a subcomponent of welfare. And if you think about it yourself, when you're not well, A, you feel rubbish, B, you don't want to do the things that you normally do. But we have a massive advantage over a lot of the sort of prey species that we keep. To us, it doesn't matter if we're ill. If you're a prey species, that marks you out as an animal that will be the one that's picked off. They, I am sure, know that they are not in a good place when they are ill, and I think that exacerbates how they feel when they are ill. So when you look at measures of things like flock or herd mortality, that's such a crude measure of welfare and a very crude measure of health, actually. So that's a little hobby horse done. And of course, natural behaviour. If you can't do what you want to do, if a sow is trying to build a nest because for thousands of years that's how pigs have evolved to be. They build a beautiful nest, it's springy, they go off on their own, they have their piglets in calm and quiet. And we stop them doing that. We don't let them go away from other sows. We might give them some straw if we're lucky, or if they're lucky. And they can't build a proper nest when their piglets squeal because they might be accidentally about to lay on them. They don't have enough time to respond quickly enough before they squash their piglets. then you hear people saying, if you keep them in this, we have to keep them in farrowing crates because they crush their piglets. Well, nature wouldn't have allowed them to evolve to be that bad a mother. It's just that we hamper them with the way that we keep them. So there are those three components. I've skimmed over them because we really don't have much time. But when you bring them all together and an animal is experiencing good mental well-being, it's able to exhibit its natural behaviour, and its physical well-being is good, it experiences a state that is probably better than, one of those being missing. And we would like to think, as animal welfare scientists, that means an animal is having a positive quality of life rather than just one that's good enough. So, time for a bit of interaction from the audience. What do you think is on the screen now? You might have to shout if it's from the back because I won't be able to hear you. Any ideas? Okay, so, am I on these? Yeah. Okay, so, rather like Francoise, fascinated by Nagel and what's it like to be a bat. So when I was doing my PhD research, I asked the question, what's it like to be a pig? This is pig vision. So taking the attributes we know of pigs' vision, as you can see, they can't see very well. This is what a sow a metre away from the edge of the pen could see of that image. So for me, the key thing is, and I'm reiterating what Francois says, it's thinking about the welfare of the animal from its own perspective. Now, when you're thinking about what's it like to be a pig, unless you're really short-sighted like me, it's hard to imagine what it's like to be profoundly visually impaired or classified as blind, which is what pigs would be if they were humans. So when you look at all the research that has showed us how amazing pigs are, bear in mind we've presented them a visual paradigm and they can't see very well. What could they tell us if we studied their intellect and their intelligence in a paradigm that they did work in really well, like scent? So there's so much we still don't know, and there are so many different ways to think about animal welfare. So we've talked about welfare potentials of systems, if we should indeed be calling them systems. So we've got our definition of welfare, what it is. We have different housing systems. We have the wonderful system at Wilma and David's farm. And please forgive me, if you were rubbish stockman, your animals could still be experiencing really poor welfare. So welfare potential of a system is one thing. How the animals experience that system is another layer which tells you how good their welfare will be. Certainly from a compassion in wild farming system, we think there are a huge range of systems that, however well you manage them, won't give an animal an acceptable quality of life. Hence we have campaigns like End the Cage Age, where we try to get all animals out of cages, because that restricts animals so much they can't exhibit the behaviours that they need to, and it gives them a frankly poor quality of life. So again, I think that for cattle, access to woodland and grazing and being with their calves is really how they evolved to be. So therefore, accompanied with good stockmen, I would be quite happy to say that those cows are having a good quality of life. I'm sure you'd all agree with me. Now, I had a discussion with our colleagues from this morning about intensive mob grazing, because from a welfare science perspective, it raises alarm bells for me. I haven't considered it enough to actually draw any conclusions, but having seen what we saw this morning, and it just being stocker cattle, it's allayed a lot of my concerns. But if we were talking about cows and calves and we were continually moving them and we were moving them very regularly, to me that would be saying, are we removing too much choice from their lives? So I just want to leave that question there. And it's one that, with my pasture-fed livestock association hat on, it's something that I'm thinking a lot about. So, We know about animal sentience, we know about animal welfare, we know about the welfare potential of systems. But if you're a policymaker, how do you take that into account when you are putting together policy? And I'm talking about this because we need to persuade policymakers that what we are doing with our extensive high welfare systems is what gets put into policy. So you would have gathered also from the conversations on welfare so far, there's a huge ethical component to animal welfare. We can use animal welfare science to give us factual information. We can look at existing legislation and we can put those two together and decide if ethically as a society we're happy with them. If we're not, we can then use animal welfare science to gather evidence to say we need to change the law and make certain systems unviable. Again, Francoise has talked very much about our hosts and the wonderful things that they do. But if you ask me, and if you look at that welfare triad that I've just put up, I think that this farm ticks all those boxes in animal welfare and ethical terms. And we need to be trying to drive food production systems, farming, to be ethical, to be sustainable. So what does an ethical food system look like? Well, one of the biggest flaws with the current system, both in the UK and globally, is that people like yourselves, producers, farmers, they don't get public money for doing the public good that you do. A lot of farmers, as we all know, get a lot of money for effectively trashing the environment and the farms that they're on. So it's really important that policy recognises where people are doing good and rewards it appropriately. And I think this is really well encapsulated with the Sustainable Food Trust's Hidden Cost of Food document, which showed basically if we incorporated all the negative externalities, all of the costs that are being borne by the environment or human health, that the cost of, inverted commas, cheap food would double. So that just goes to show how cheap food isn't cheap, but people are getting rewarded for doing it the wrong way because they don't have to fund everything. So, another element of sustainability and systems lasting in the way that we've heard from our panel this morning, wildlife coming back, etc. Diversity is key. I mean, diversity is key in any ecological system. So when I go and talk to policymakers, I talk about the ABCD of diversity. Agrodiversity, so farming more than the 3 key species of grain that the land produces, etc., the 5 key species of animals. Biodiversity, cultural diversity, because people have different needs from food systems and different cultural histories. And also dietary diversity, not one size fits all in a diet. I'm going to rush through a little bit more. So as I've mentioned, I do go to places like the UN. I wanted to reassure you, really, because we sit here in the UK, in our farms, at meetings like this, and actually globally, in the top-down sense, the UN, Chatham House, loads of places really understand the need to move to a regenerative agriculture system. It will take time to trickle down, but the right noises are being made in the right places. I'll skim through. Okay, so again, zero malnutrition is a key UN target. It's embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. Our governments need to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. So zero malnutrition is a really handy way of framing things for policymakers to listen to. So, you know, we used to be aware of malnutrition used to be underfeeding, not enough calories. Nearly 50% of the global population is either underfed or overfed, and we have lost that happy medium. So again, good quality food from good quality systems, eaten in the right amounts, is a key component for a sustainable diet. And again, we are so well placed to be delivering that. Now I'm going to skim on a little bit because I want to finish with a video. And I wanted to just show you a video that Compassion has done, and it's about fish welfare, something that's becoming much, much more important. And of course, sustainable fisheries are really important in Scotland too. So bear with me, I'm going to go a minute or so over. Sorry about that. But fish.
The world we share. From afar, it doesn't look too exciting. But going closer, humans, with our complex, beautiful, messy, emotional lives. And there's another world we're only just beginning to see clearly. The underwater world of fish. Scientists have recently proved that fish have complex emotional lives too. They're sociable, collaborative, and creative. They have elaborate courting rituals, like us. They make sacrifices for their children, like this cichlid who goes without eating to keep her babies safe in her mouth. Fish protect each other in the face of predators, use tools to solve problems, and travel thousands of kilometers together each year. They even work together across species, like this grouper and eel who hunt as a team. Some fish have amazed scientists by passing advanced cognitive tests, and their nervous systems respond to stimuli, like ours. And they do feel pain. They might not look so exciting from afar, but coming closer, there's life. Complex, beautiful, emotional. Everything we thought we knew about the lives of fish is being challenged. Given our new understanding of the way fish think and feel, we can't go on as we have before. It's time to rethink fish.
If I can ask both of you to come back up along with Dr. Kathryn Ellis from vet school at Glasgow, and just to take a few questions from the audience.
Okay, not sure if everyone can hear me. Firstly, I think it was a brave decision from Wilma and David to ask not only a vet, but a vet who works in academia, so doubly evil person to facilitate the session. Say thank you for our two speakers for their thought-provoking presentations. I was going to try and have a slightly more traditional Q&A session here. So if anybody has got any questions, I'm sure there will be lots of questions, but if anybody has got any questions, if you would like to raise your hand, one of the roving mics will pick you up. But if you could just say who you are and where you're from, that would be great. So if anybody does have any questions for our two speakers, please raise your hand.
Susan Jarvis from the University of Edinburgh. It's probably a question for Angela, I guess, but it's about having worked myself on the issue of the farrowing crate, and you mentioned about sort of hampering them with the way that we keep them in relation to crushing of piglets.
Yes.
And also in your kind of table, there was a sort of section on management. I just wondered if you could comment on the implications of breeding, because we have for decades been intensely breeding pigs for increased litter size. And this has perhaps exacerbated the issues, including the way that we keep them.
Yes. Oh, okay. No, absolutely. Is this working? No. Not yet. Is it working now? Or I'm on this? Okay, well, I hope you can hear me. I agree with you. There are so many factors. scientists like to reduce things down to single factors because if we want to test things, it's the only way that you can do so reliably without things getting confounded. However, pigs are complex biological systems. There are so many factors that affect particularly sows, overfarrowing, etc. Absolutely, we have selected them for larger litter sizes, which inevitably does make it harder for a sow because she has to keep track of a larger number of piglets. However, we have also selectively bred for sows that are less responsive when their piglets squeal, because when we, in inverted commas conventional systems, want to do all the management things like chopping off tails and cutting out teeth and possibly castrating if you're a male pig, then your piglet is going to squeal a lot. So sows that are less responsive have been selected over generations as well. You combine it with something like, nature provided a really elaborate nest. So it's not just some straw that's been rearranged. A sow would take herself off a couple of kilometres away from the rest of the herd. She would start by laying down branches, and she would use finer and finer material until she lined it with grass so that her piglets have this elaborate nest. But what I was alluding to, aware that I didn't have much time, is if you think of the feedback mechanism of a piglet squealing and there being time for the sow to respond before it's crushed too much, and the nest gives you that safety limit, we have made it really, really difficult for modern sows to be good mothers. And I think that's so sad and one of the sort of cruelest things we could have done to them. And I know that's emotive language, but I do think we have made life very hard for them.
Any further questions?
Really work other than keeping them together?
I know there's someone in the audience that would be able to answer that.
Yeah. Could I just maybe cut over 2 seconds and just say, are you asking about the ethics or the welfare, or both?
Because that seems to be a central theme here, but realistically in the dairy industry, it isn't going to happen on a huge scale, certainly not intensively. And there is means of, yes, you've got the separation, but rearing calves in groups, rearing them at pasture, you get a lot of the benefits without having the cows. So, where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I'm sure there are people in the audience that would address this. I think from the experiences that we've had from work we've done at the vet school, there's an ethical question about the separation. There's a welfare and a health question about the management of those calves in whatever system it is. And I think lots of farmers across the board, and I think it's an important point that was made by one of our speakers earlier, about having a really broad tent and not putting barriers up that don't need to be there, and about having good farmers in organic systems, good farmers in non-organic systems. But I think there's a lot of farmers out there, and there's a big majority of farmers that could raise their standards a bit and make a massive difference to welfare. And I think things like ensuring adequate colostrum and all those really, really important things that sadly a lot of people don't get right, I think that from a welfare perspective goes a long way. But I think the ethics of the separation is a slightly different sort of question. But I think there are people in the audience that might want to address that. If anybody has any particular other comments on that.
Hi, Phil Brook from Compassion in Well Farming. You have touched on two of the things yourself, which is group rearing right from the start and giving them access to pasture when you can. Those have got to be two really great things. One of the things, of course, in organic farming is that the calves have to be fed on real milk for the first 2 months. So there you have a really good case for keeping them together, at least for that point, even if that makes the separation harder later. In favour of it, although the separation is harder later, keeping calves together even for 1 week, as many organic farmers do, preferably a bit longer, is really good for the development of their social skills. So those are things moving in that direction. Bearing in mind that you've got to feed organic milk for 2 months, a surrogate mother is going to be another way of doing that, so that the calves have the benefit of the mother and some of the mothers have the benefit of calves. Continuing further with the model here, people may be persuaded that you no longer need to keep a suckler cow to produce calves, so you have a saving on grass. You have calves growing faster. I know SRUC have crunched the data for Rainer Farm here, and the hope is that there are gains as well as losses once you've overcome some of the major management issues that you have here. So lots of things you can do, I think, that make it better, and a lot of organic farmers are doing some of them already.
There's a question, a person at the back in the stripy T-shirt there.
Graham Tweddle, organic dairy farmer. I just want to ask the whole panel at the front, is welfare an education issue or a legislation issue, bearing in mind that farmers respond to the marketplace?
Okay, well, I think that's an incredibly good question, and I think the answer is both. And I think educating the consumer to what they're buying is a really, really important way to deal with things. However, I think that given that welfare is such a crucial component to farming systems and the negative effects that it can have on an animal's quality of life, I think that there does need to be a legislative component too. And one of the things that Compassion does is work with food businesses to sort of use the carrot. We give awards for good dairy, good egg, good all sorts of things. Because you're right, consumers do drive a lot of choice in the food system at the moment.
Yes, of course, I'd agree with that, and I think it is both important in the sense that changes in thinking about welfare can bring with it a need for changes in system, in how, and those aren't easily changed. Can be incredibly high cost attached to changes in buildings or layout, and farmers clearly need support for that, and so that can be achieved maybe through legislation and government support. But on the other hand, if the consumer isn't educated, if as a society these changes, there are changes in language often, suddenly concepts start to pop up and have, like sentience is playing a very important mediatory role in society. And if you start educating children and farmers and at all levels of professional education to work with these concepts, then when our way of thinking changes, then our ability to use these effective, to know what it means to work with animals as sentient beings, that it has to have some meaning and there has to be financial support.
Thank you. I think in the interests of our welfare, so that we can get lunch, I'll hand you back to Wilma.
Thanks, everybody.